Hello again, panelists and the participants on this panel, which will be mostly about the development of offshore grids rather than the projects. And I'll quickly jump to our first panelist, who's Joachim Balke from the European Commission. As you know, he's the head of unit for networks and regional initiatives. And I think that everybody from the industry, everybody from the member states, also the administration, is looking at the Commission now and also at Joachim to tell us more about the piece of legislation that we are expecting the most, which is the new 10E regulation, which is going to be redrafted soon. We were hoping to see it already in December, but it's still time to be produced by the college. So Joachim, without further delay, I would really like to hear from the Commission and I suppose the colleagues who are joining our conference too, on where we are on the 10E regulation and what we should expect from this new legislation, also in connection to the CEF fund. Joachim, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mariusz, for the presentation and the invitation to this conference, which is very topical. I will indeed try to, let's say, build a bit the bridge between the offshore strategy, which is already out, and those pieces of legislation which are coming, including the 10E. To start, nevertheless, with where we're coming from the offshore, with the offshore strategy, because that is indeed one of the sort of core strategic documents now, which will also inform the further legislation, including the 10E proposal. Clearly, the context in which we've published the offshore strategy is the one of reaching net zero and the climate target plan. We see the blue backdrop of the ocean, which is, I think, very topical as well. Because clearly we will need to use the full renewable potential of the ocean and our seas to get to net zero, meaning that in particular we will have to upscale really a lot renewables in the electricity sector. Just to recap that here, the main message is that basically we will need to have round about 65% of our electricity covered by renewables in only 10 years. So that is really a lot, and it means that we will need all kinds of offshore renewable energies, and we will need to tap it fully. So just to recap briefly the figures, which surely you've heard already today, the upscale that we have in mind is when it comes to offshore wind, from today's 12 giga to around about 60 in 2030, and round about 300 in 2050. And we also do see an important role for ocean energy, which today is rather sort of at a pre-commercial stage. But we do see that it could contribute with about a giga in 2030 and anything up to 40 gigawatt in 2050 to the overall mix. And such a mix would certainly also be beneficial from a, let's say, from a system perspective. What that means, and that leads us to our topic of this session, which is regional cooperation, is clearly that there's going to be a very massive upscale of activity in sea basins where you will have rather limited space available and where you will have, or where you have already rather significant pre-existing uses. And I think that is sort of the key environment in which we will have to manage this upscale in a way which will be efficient, not only from an economic point of view, but also from a point of view of resource use and use of space. And I think that we need to keep in mind also if we talk about grid planning, to which we'll come in a second. If we go to the next slide, I cannot do this presentation without stressing that the offshore strategy is not only about the North Sea, and it's even not only about the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, although the Baltic Sea is certainly high up in the interest of today's conference, given its key importance for the region that you're representing. But let us not forget that the specific potential of the North Sea, which has led to this very steep growth in bottom fixed offshore wind installations, isn't really available in other sea basins in Europe, neither in the Mediterranean nor in the Atlantic, and only to a very limited extent in the Black Sea, and hence the necessity to develop a fuller range of technologies up to commercial availability at commercial scale. And I would also not want to do this presentation without mentioning that even landlocked countries, or landlocked regions for that matter, can benefit from the growth in offshore wind and other offshore technologies, because there are, as you can see in the map on the right side, significant manufacturing capacities which are linked to wind and also offshore installment, also in such landlocked regions, and they can thus also be beneficial, for example, to some of the regions which are otherwise perhaps negatively affected by by the demise in certain high carbon and high emitting technologies. That being said, let's come to the next slide and move closer to the topic of the discussion in this panel, which is all about regional cooperation and why do we need it and how it can help. First of all, regional cooperation is necessary and possible at the level of maritime spatial planning. I think that's the first dimension we need to stress, and that goes back to what I said earlier. Space is going to be very limited, so we need from the beginning a rather sort of rational and coordinated approach to how to use it. That means that we need to look at maritime spatial planning as a key tool. We have a directive in place which requires member states to deliver their plans by March next year. But crucially, here in that dimension, we've said that cross-border cooperation is necessary on the when member states devise these plans, because we do think that the assessment of the effects of the massive growth of offshore is best assessed in a sea basin dimension, because that will allow to measure the cumulative effects of that upscaling. And we're talking here both about the generation assets as well as the transmission necessary to link them. All of that can best be done in a sea basin, on a sea basin level. And that's why we see that regional cooperation on the maritime spatial planning as a key dimension. Also very important to mention that we do see the necessity to have a good link between member states' plans on the MSP side and their plans for developments of clean energy. And that means in particular the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans. Here I think it's very key that these two instruments are coherent to ensure that basically the space needs are fully taken into account of that development. Coming to the next slide, then the second dimension that is clearly key in terms of regional cooperation is grid planning. That brings us closer to the question of 10E. So clearly we do see a role for joint and hybrid projects, because I think all studies point to the fact that with the massive upscale, which is going to happen, as I said, in limited sea spaces, there is a role for such joint and hybrid projects in an overall efficient rollout of the necessary infrastructure. That does not mean that it is an objective in themselves to go for hybrids. National projects can absolutely continue to play a role where that makes economic sense. But again, I think we have sufficient evidence to show that as part of an overall economically and also environmentally efficient picture, hybrids are going to play a part, given that volumes are going to multiply, and given also that the distance to shore of the installation is bound to increase on average. So this being said, clearly to enable such projects, it is necessary to enhance the level of cooperation on a number of fronts. If we come to the next slide, we can then indeed look at what is needed on the grid side. And here we have identified a couple of elements, some of which, not all of which, we do indeed intend also to address through the 10E review. And clearly the first one, we do think that it's necessary to come to a more integrated planning of grids, offshore grids on a regional basis, including but not limited to hybrid assets, going a bit beyond the rather sort of piece by piece way that sort of the offshore grid has grown and been planned so far. That's the sort of first and overriding point. Secondly, that will probably have to be based on common vision, common commitments for the deployment of offshore renewables of the member states in the region as the basis for developing such an integrated grid planning. Thirdly, clearly we see the need that the investment framework for grids, for infrastructure, allows at least a certain degree of anticipatory investment to allow such integrated grids to be realized. Then fourthly, we see a need for clearer guidance as regards the sharing of costs and benefits for such integrated infrastructure. That is clearly a stumbling block that has been also pointed out in the context of discussions in the Council, where offshore conclusions are close to an agreement. It has been pointed again and again, I would say, in the context of the regional groups, in particular NSEC, which has looked at that. So that is a clear element. And then lastly, we do need to further develop the technology. There is a need still to prove that multi-terminal HVDC systems can function at large scale, and it has to be ensured that they're interoperable to avoid lock-in. So I think this is what we see as the key elements which need to be realized. As I said, the 10E is one instrument among others which we have to use in that sense. There are a number of complementary elements which do need to be in place, we think, as well, to make this a coherent picture. One is clarity on the applicable market rules that will be that should be sort of fit for that large scale upscale that we envisage. And here these market rules should send the right investment signals on the one hand, and on the other hand, enable efficient operation in line with the internal market principles. We have hence looked at the concept of offshore bidding zone as one which we think is useful in that context and future-proof, in fact. That might require also the need to look at a couple of additional elements which I've listed here, but perhaps won't go too much into detail. The question of the grid connection, the question of the congestion charges has been raised a couple of times in that context, and we've addressed that also in the context of the communication, because there is a certain correlation which needs to be addressed, at least for a certain number of projects. But importantly, I would also like to point to the fact that there is a link between let's say the market arrangements and making the concept of offshore bidding zones in particular a viable one, and let's say our ability to push for a sufficient grid build out on time, because that I think we hear it again and again also from investors is a key element that could reduce risk in that context. So that's why I think the questions of how we deal with the grid planning in the future, grid planning and realization, and the question of the market arrangements are in fact linked to a certain extent. I would perhaps use the rest of my time to point very briefly to the fact that we do, of course, also have a number of financing instruments on the table. That should not deflect attention from the fact that the bulk of the investment will have to come from private sources, private investors. I think that's clear to everybody who sees the numbers, but that is not to minimize that there are significant financing instruments on the table on EU level. But of course, quick agreement on the MFF would be extremely helpful in that context. That is also clear. There are a number of horizontal instruments which have, for which we hope we will have an agreement soon, because they would have a very significant firepower financially. The Recovery and Resilience Facility, of course, the Horizon Europe, because there is still investment also on a on a research R&I side to be done, but also crucially InvestEU, because here, if we look at, for example, the role that the EIB has had in making finance possible for the early projects of bottom fixed offshore wind in the North Sea. We've seen that actually the role of sort of public sector loans was quite key in getting the finance together for such projects. So that's why we think it would be also important, then in particular also for technologies which are upcoming, that there are instruments available which can sort of crowd in private investments, also perhaps in those technologies or those regions where that's not yet self-evident. Lastly, you asked about CEF, the Connecting Europe facility, and that is an important factor, but much smaller in scale, of course, and that means that it will continue to be used as a, I would say, a measure of last resort for infrastructure projects that cannot be financed otherwise through the market. But of course, now the novelty of Connecting Europe facility is that we will have the renewables window. And what we see is that the combination of both, so the let's say traditional energy window of CEF, geared infrastructure, and the renewables window will allow basically to cover in particular also offshore projects in a coherent manner. That's at least the aim. Through the 10E, we're looking also specifically then at sort of how to clarify rules and the scope to ensure that we have a full coverage. I would just point out that even in the last round of CEF financing, we have financed a number of projects relevant in this context. The North Sea Offshore Wind Power Hub is one to mention, but I would also mention that investment in the Baltic synchronization project, in particular the Harmony Link, has sort of an important offshore component to it as well. So it is an instrument which in a targeted manner already helps to promote offshore, and we hope that can be continued and reinforced in the future. Sorry, I've taken a bit longer, but thanks very much for having borne with me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That's absolutely not a problem. Thank you, Joachim, for this presentation, a very comprehensive one, and I think that one that is showing what we should be expecting in the coming months from the European Commission. Point taken on the MFF. I think it is very important that the heads of governments agree on the MFF. But I think also what was very interesting was the issue that you have raised on the hybrid offshore wind farms. I think a topic that is now being scrutinized very carefully in Central Europe. And what I can only say, just not to take too much time, is that definitely what we hear and see in Central Europe, there is a need for a strong dialogue between the Commission and the stakeholders in Central Europe on this, because it's an elephant in the room, I think. A type of project that causes a bit of anxiety in Central Europe on how it's going to be developed, and it's also always good to have a dialogue with the operators and the stakeholders on this in order to understand where all the parties are. So thank you very much, Joachim, for this. Without further delay, because we're a bit behind the schedule, I'll pass the floor to Øyvind Vessia from Ørsted, who's joining us today. And this is the first time that I will need to read from my paper, because what I wanted to do is to give you a quotation from Ørsted website that I found particularly interesting when researching for the conference. So you can find this passage on Ørsted is that little less than a decade ago, Ørsted, we were an oil and gas company. We were one of the most coal-intensive power utilities in Europe. Today, we are the energy company in Europe, which has the highest share of renewables in its portfolio. And for the companies in Central Europe, which are now undergoing a major transformation from coal-intensive into the new technologies, renewables, and clean low-carbon power generation. An example of a company like Ørsted, I think, is a very good thing to watch and observe, and we would love, Øyvind, for you to tell us how Ørsted has done it. How have you managed to transform your company such quickly and without, I think, major troubles? So, Øyvind, the floor is yours.
Many thanks also for the invitation to speak here today. My presentation will be quick. I will try to briefly answer your question, Marius, and then I'll just talk 2 minutes about a very concrete hybrid project that is coming up in the Baltic Sea. So, starting with the transformation, I think this slide is summarizing at least some of the indicators of what you were mentioning. You can see to the far left the intensity of CO2 emissions from our power production, which you can see has been reduced with 85% since 2007. This is, of course, a lot thanks to offshore wind build-out, but it's also thanks to converting old thermal power plants that used to run on coal. We also closed down a fair amount of coal power plants. Then, in terms of our the business transformation, you can see that back in 2007, we were earning 7% of our EBITDA on renewables. If we look for this year, the guidance that we're given to the markets is that 98% of our EBITDA will be coming from renewables. And then I think talking about the EBITDA, it's also interesting to look at the third column, which is just showing how much of that is actually generated outside of Denmark. Because this transformation from a more fossil-based company to a renewables-based company has also happened in tandem with becoming a much more international company. And your question, Marius, was about how could this happen? And this slide certainly doesn't give all the answers. I mean, here you can see how the first offshore wind turbine in Vindeby in Denmark in '91 was, compared to today's standards, a very, very tiny project. But what I want to indicate with this slide is how the different technology steps have been crucial in bringing down the costs. Because in order to move, for example, from like a typical onshore turbine of 2 megawatts in the 2000s to having a more dedicated offshore turbine of 3 megawatts and later 3.6 and 6 and 8 and now most recently 12 megawatts. It's been essential that Siemens Gamesa, MHI Vestas and GE, that they as suppliers, that they have been able to see some continuity in the portfolio and that we could place big orders, not just for 30 turbines for the next project, but to place an order of, let's say, 100 or 200 turbines, which then can defend the R&D investments in making a new turbine platform that is then more cost efficient. And the reason that we could place these much bigger orders is thanks to, I would highlight, the UK government, the Danish government, and the German government, that all together had belief in offshore wind being a possible solution, which then in turn enabled us to make these big investments, which then in turn made the suppliers able to invest in new turbines that are bigger and more efficient. And this is what you can see the results in here. Going back only to 2012, the cost was 167 euros per megawatt hour. Today, of course, this depends a bit on the scope, it depends on wind speed, etc. But in general, and of course, very importantly, as Giles mentioned earlier today, it depends on the type of framework. So if you have a risk-sharing system like a contract for difference, an LCOE of offshore wind, including the grid connection today, is around 56 euros per megawatt hour, which is, as you can see, very competitive with other sources. So when you might ask what kind of is the framework that can help Central European companies to do a similar transformation, it is about this stable framework that enables you gradually to convert your fleet of generation technologies from fossil to renewables. And here, the contracts for difference that Giles mentioned, I mean, they were not called that back in 2012 and earlier, but it was a similar type of system that gave revenue certainty, which then enabled this to happen. Now, just using 2 minutes on the Baltic Sea and upcoming hybrid project, which we think is very exciting. This is part of the Danish energy agreement, and is also part of their plan to reach 70% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. And here you can see this is the western part of the Baltic Sea, and it's the island of Bornholm, which is in between Germany, Poland, Sweden, and Denmark. So here we don't need to build an offshore hub. We can use an existing island to place electric components on this island and connect the offshore wind here, and then send it to Denmark and Poland as the first planned connections. This, I should say, with a caveat, still needs to be agreed between Denmark and Poland. So kind of connecting this to the headlines of today's panel and this discussion, for this to happen, we do see as a requirement that there is cross-border cooperation between at least Poland and Denmark to make this happen. Then secondly, and this is a bit what Joachim mentioned in terms of the offshore bidding zone and the regulatory setup, we certainly agree that an offshore bidding zone is more future-proof and is a more scalable approach. And we think that is the right way forward. But it is also true that it's opened up a lot of new questions that are not immediate to answer in terms of revenue certainty and also curtailment risks. And this needs to be clarified as soon as possible so that tenders can happen for these Bornholm hybrids within the next couple of years, which will be necessary for Denmark to meet its commitment. And I think it would also be necessary to also speed up the general development in the Baltic Sea, because this Bornholm project is just one idea. I think if you look further up north in the Baltic Sea, you can find many such opportunities that brings together the benefits of interconnection with the benefits of feeding in more offshore wind. Finally, let me just then say in terms of the 10E that might not be relevant for Bornholm because the timing might not fit, but going forward, having hybrids as a separate asset class in the 10E could certainly be very helpful to make sure that this is not an interconnector and it's not a radio connection, and it deserves as such a separate focus, because it actually, and I think this was also mentioned by a previous speaker, it is a different type of setup. It is not an interconnector. And then linked to the 10E is, of course, also ENS2E's very important work with a 10-year network development plan, where it's important to get these type of projects identified.
Thank you, Øyvind. Well, I don't know where to start because there are so many very interesting points that you have raised in your presentation. So I think what I will underline that what is expected from the industry, I think, to the decision makers is what you have rightfully said as the predictability and the stability of the legislation. And I think especially for the projects that you have mentioned, the hybrid projects which are now being developed and are now the new thing on the market, I think it is very important that we clearly understand what kind of category of this project will be in the 10E regulation. And also a very specific point I will make, which has caused a number of significant troubles all around the sectors, including electricity and gas sector, so the cross-border cost allocation problem, yes? And I think that a very well-tailored methodology for cross-border cost allocation within the 10E framework for this kind of projects will be something that can incentivize the industry and incentivize the project promoters to try to use this kind of approach more often. So we're looking forward to the developments on this project. I think that there will be some serious discussion in the upcoming months and years on this. And hopefully we'll see this project develop before the 2030. And now, taking stock of the discussion we've had with Øyvind, I think we will move to our colleague from LITGRID, Liutauras Varanavičius. And to Liutauras, I have a different question, because as we're talking now about the infrastructure, there is a lot of discussion, as you have already seen, about the connecting the offshore wind farms to the national systems, or preparing the hybrid farms. But my question would be a bit different. Taking into account the number of countries we have in the Baltic and the distribution of these countries, do you think that what we could expect in the upcoming 10 or 20 years would be a grid, a Baltic grid that would connect all of these countries offshore, so that we could expect cables to be run down throughout the seashore, which would connect both the farms and the member states, and this kind of an approach would work more like an interconnector, a very innovative interconnector that would connect all the countries? Or do you expect that the wind farms will be simply connected traditionally to the national grids, and all trade will happen within the member states themselves? So without further delay, I pass the floor to Liutauras.
Thanks for introduction. I am glad to participate here. So thank you very much. Let me share the slides. So very briefly on Baltic Sea offshore grid vision. To answer to your question very briefly, I do believe strongly in a meshed grid in 10 to 20 years. However, we have certain key issues to discuss and to solve, and this conference helps it a lot, I believe. Let me start with one mega project which currently Baltic states are undergoing, and you are familiar from starting from Commissioner, everybody knows it, Baltic State synchronization. So towards continental Europe, it's a mega project for us. It's historical project, and I would like to underline here that European community, European support, our neighbors support, Poland support, our Nordic countries support, I mean Germany, all the rest of Europe, by enabling synchronization, in fact, are enabling also offshore wind development, renewables development. Let me explain you why, very briefly. First of all, we have received big funding support from European Commission towards our internal grid reinforcement, which was obviously necessary for Baltic State synchronization with continental Europe. So this support will also enable offshore grid development in Baltic states. So that is, we have a saying, one shot, two rabbits. So that's synergies we create by developing this synchronization mega project. Second example could be synchronous compensators or condensers, as call it, because intermittent renewables offshore as well, they do not create a so-called inertia as byproduct, and we have to solve this during our synchronization project, and we're solving it by installing 9 pieces of equipment into 3 in each Baltic country, which will also support a bigger scale of renewables integration into Baltic states. One of the examples we already been mentioning today, one of the biggest projects in Europe currently being developed in Baltic states, in Lithuania in particular, is up to 200 megawatts battery park, which is a huge ambition for Lithuania. And if we will succeed, we will have a tool helping us to manage the renewables integration and the future renewables increase. And finally, let me give you a very simple example, which is out of cost-benefit analysis done by operators for second stage of synchronization, which identified the benefits for Poland by possibility to increase up to 1,000 megawatt, 1 gigawatt of offshore wind development in Poland just by doing synchronization, in particular Harmony Link. So those pieces which we create together now up until 2025 are the basis we put for future Baltic states offshore wind development. That's fantastic. We already have a joint ambition. That's another message from me. and we can go from left to right or from bottom to up. But I mean, we have European tools such as offshore strategy currently developed. We have new financing possibilities. We have recently European Commission BEMIP study, which identified 4 hubs in the Baltic Sea. I won't name it, but you should read it. It's fantastic, publicly available document for us to think about. Where are the best places to develop such a meshed grid? Where are the hubs most probably to be developed in the future? Then we shall not forget the declaration of Szczecin in end of September, I think, where 8 member states have signed a joint declaration of intent to develop the Baltic Sea offshore wind, which is fantastic. Clear sign for us to follow. And in fact, soon, maybe this or next week, 8 Baltic states operators will follow on memorandum implementing practical steps towards renewables integration, in particular offshore in this region. So you know that our ambition is huge. We have to increase up to 25 times the currently installed capacities by 2050. A few key factors to consider is, of course, solutions or selections or dilemmas. Shall we go for a regional partnership or shall we go for a radial connection, as you just mentioned, Mariusz? And Lithuania has selected a radial offshore wind park as a first step with a joint cooperation of Luxembourg, but it's not a physical cross-border. We have our neighbors' examples of Bornholm Island, Poland, and Denmark, which is hybrid project. We have Estonia, Latvia to the right side on the map, which is also hybrid project. So for me is the question if all of us should do simultaneously in the Baltic Sea the same steps or similar steps towards the same technology of hybrid technology, finally to be meshed into one piece, or shall we develop different strategies? One countries start from radial, then go for hybrid, or other countries go immediately for the hybrid. This decides on regional partnership. So I think our minister also mentioned this. The most important is to do this in partnership in region, then we can achieve the ambitious goals. Naturally, with partnership goes cost efficiency. That is very, very important. If we want to save our and spend our consumers' money in most efficient way, we shall seek for sharing and effectiveness. Then by maybe doing less infrastructure, we get more from maritime perspective. We save nature, because if we do 1, 2, or 3 radial connections towards platforms towards sea compared to one hybrid, that is something to be considered. Of course, utilization of investments or stranded onshore is also helping by developing hybrid projects, because you receive new routes how to deliver stranded onshore renewable. Harmony Link will also help in doing this to release it. And of course, we should seek for innovative solutions. I know that certain countries in West Europe are already considering and creating formats to deliver new innovative solutions, which could be standardized and used as a simple Lego pieces, among all Baltic Sea, to possibly expand in the future if it's necessary. That is very, very important, to be unified. So my last slide and my last message is we are seeking for a future-proof solution. We are considering offshore grid for 2050. That's our strong message, and we are true believers on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Liutauras, for this very inspiring, I think, presentation. Here in SIP, we also have been following very closely the developments on the battery park, I suppose we can call it like this, that is being developed in Lithuania. I think that this shows clearly that by combining the innovative technologies with the traditional technologies, yes, in one place, you can not only increase the capacities, but add a certain added value. Yes, as you have mentioned, the harmonic simply by the construction adds another capacity to the Polish market, and this is an added value that you wouldn't do in any other way by except of constructing a new power plant. So I think that this kind of an approach is very important, and within the Central Europe, where the countries are quite small and the markets are quite small, I think that this can bring a certain added value to the markets and the investors who are investing in our region. Thank you very much for this insight, Liutauras. And now, because we're a bit behind the schedule, so I'll move very quickly to Gheorghe Visan from Transelectrica, because we have covered very extensively, I think, the Baltic and the perspectives of what we have in Crete, but it's not the only sea in Central Europe, and we would be very, very happy to hear about what we should be expecting from the Black Sea. So, George, without any delay, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariusz, and thank you for the invitation. That was a very interesting conference up to now, and very, let's say, instructive for me. I see that we are going around the continent little by little, and in our attempt to downsize and finally to shut down the polluting industry, we are trying to find solution for our systems to go in a coordinated and safe manner in order to ensure the security of supply for all the customers in Europe. I also took note of the good and the meaningful summary from the EU strategy, offshore strategy, in the beginning of this panel. And of course, being an interested party, us as Romania, and we as a transmission system operator, not only in our position as system and transmission operator, but also in the position of market creators, because I'm coming from the market, so I'm deeply involved in that. I think that our main purpose would be in the very short time to link the offshore developments to the infrastructure developments, and also with the market developments. And I will just go to the next slide. Hopefully it goes. So thanks to our colleagues from the Energy Policy Group and Dunărea de Jos University of Galați, we have now a study of Romania offshore wind and energy potential, which is very important for us. And I hope that this study will also be taken into consideration to the next steps for development of offshore energy potential of Black Sea at large. They have identified two potential clusters, very important one, not too far from the shore. And we, as a system transmission operator, we are ready to develop the infrastructure in order to open the opportunities for the developments and for transmitting the electricity to the continent. And I will go to the next slide just to give you a flavor of the ongoing projects with work in progress. And with some projects for transmitting the electricity to the continent, and not only in Romania, but to Europe at large, because you know that Romania is part of the two capacity calculation regions. One is core region, where the main consumption in Europe is present. And the second region is also a region with poor adequacy, I would say, the Southeast European region, where a lot of fossil energy is used now. And I think the future will be bringing energy from the sea to this region as well. So I will go to the next slide. I put here the map of transmission system, Romanian transmission system. What you see here with magenta, there are projects ongoing. Some of them I will point them here in the Black Sea coastal region are already under developments, new transmission lines between the coastal region to the middle of Romania and beyond. And you see here on the right side, I took the liberty to take from the study of our colleagues from Energy Policy Group. You see the most promising areas for new offshore developments. And from the total potential of the Black Sea, even only a fraction for 10 to 15% will be developed in the next 10 years. And I mean by that some 3 gigawatts installed capacity. I think we will be able, Transelectrica, to transmit this power to the continent. And as we speak, we are ready to transmit 500 megawatts because this project, these new lines developed under development, and I want to underline this, they are already under development. 400 kV lines are ready to transmit this power from the offshore region to in the Romanian transmission system and beyond that in Europe. So when we speak about the development, I think we have took into account some scenarios, and from the best estimate scenario with the data from provided by TSOs for 2030 horizon and the sustainable transition scenario, distributed generation scenario, we consider as a transmission and system operator that the power from offshore development in Black Sea could be transmitted to the consumers in the next 10 years, but of course with a strong cooperation between the system and transmission operators, the stakeholders, the industry, and the authorities in general. These are the main projects. If you compare this with the map above, you will see these new lines are under development, and in the next 10 years there will be, I mean, even earlier. Some of them has the commission date in 2023 and 2024. They will be in place for strengthening the transmission system, especially for renewable integration. And because we have to be flexible and updating our plans as the industry is going to develop the offshore energy potential. This year, I mean, 2021, already considered to be in 2021. This in 2021, Transelectrica will consider technical assessment for direct current cable from Black Sea coastal area to main consumption area in Bucharest. We know that it's an expensive project, but I consider, and we generally we are considering that DC cables and DC transmission system could be operated, and it makes sense to build for the next decade in order to integrate the offshore energy into European transmission system. And I will not end my speech without underlying the most important benefits of wind integration. We have to take into account, as I've already told you, that in few years the fossil industry will go down. And we see by the offshore development the improved system adequacy, because offshore energy brings more stability, and the winds are blowing more stable in the offshore large of the Black Sea. We are also see significant opportunities for the product GDP increase and for hydrogen economy. today I heard and I fully agree that we have to give more chance to local manufacturing processes, less from Asia, more from Europe, and if possible, more from our countries. And also we see by the offshore development a significant increase of the target to 34% for Romania, from present 3 gigawatts to 6 gigawatts in 2030 horizon. And by saying that, you can see the figure. Our estimation is for 2030, the average consumption to be in Romania from 7.5 to 7.7 gigawatts hour. So you see that only the wind will be the generation installed generation will be 6 gigawatts. Even today, you know, maybe some of you very well, in Romania, 60% of energy is generated by renewables, most of them hydropower, and it's left only around 40% of the energy from fossil coal and light fuel. So I think we are in the good position to fulfill our targets. And this is the final provisional thoughts I have put on the slides. We are ready as we speak to integrate already 500 megawatts. But in the future, I think, as I've told you, we are ready to integrate more than 2,000 megawatts from Black Sea, offshore Black Sea. And of course, as I've already mentioned, we see the opportunity for not only for local developments, but also for regional cooperation with the Black Sea neighboring countries as well. And today I heard that hybrid project is a way forward. I also think I am a big supporter of hybrid projects, and I think it's the future, at least between Romania and Bulgaria, to develop such kind of project in the Black Sea. This is all. I thank you for your patience, and I'm waiting for comments and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, George. That was really inspiring again, because I think that everybody is looking into the Black Sea as something as a sea that brings a huge potential for the development of offshore grids, not only in Romania and Bulgaria, but also in Ukraine and Turkey, I suppose. And how you will be able to coordinate the effort on the European seashore in cooperation with the countries from outside of the European Union will be, I think, the main topic of the work that you will be doing, studies that you have mentioned. And I must say that I'm astonished by the ambition that you have presented. Yes, 6 gigawatts in 2030, that's really, really ambitious. And I think that we all are looking forward to hear the developments from Romania and Bulgaria on this, because this would, I think, bring a very, very different added value to the energy market there. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now we're quickly moving forward to another speaker from EQUINOR, Anders Ystad, if I spell that correctly, who I wanted to ask also again about the more European perspective. EQUINOR is an investor in a number of countries, also in Central Europe. I know that you have just opened an office in Warsaw a few months or weeks ago. So we are looking into your insights on what should we expect with respect to offshore wind in Central Europe, but not only Poland. We're also hoping for Southern Europe to be covered more in depth by you. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me over here at the Center for European Energy Partnership. Really appreciate that. I'd like actually to start with praising both the countries for stepping up so rapidly and demonstrating so big ambitions for offshore wind in that region. And I also would like to praise the EU for launching such an impressive strategy. I think deploying 300 gigawatts by 2050 of installed capacity across Europe is quite an achievement, but the job is still to be done. But we're very interested now in seeing how this will pan out in Europe. So it's a very good start. So the Baltic Sea, let me start there. We share the view of many analysts who look at the total potential in the Baltic Sea, and up to 93 gigawatts of installed capacity is quite astonishing. Going from a very limited small volumes as of today. And EQUINOR has been an early mover into the Baltic Sea, into Poland to be more specific. And yes, Marius, we did recently open an office in Warsaw, where two of my colleagues work, and on a daily basis engaged with the Polish government in trying to develop the regulatory framework for offshore wind. And I have to say, it looks very good, and we very much enjoy the dialogue that we have with the Polish authorities. We are also in the German part of the Baltic Sea in a partner operated by RWE, Arkona project. So that's where we are as of today, but we see these growth ambitions as a stepping stone to further engaging across the Baltic Sea in a number of countries. So it's looking very good for the time being. Okay, so let me also mention we are very much looking forward to the successful adoption of the offshore wind law in Poland. Okay, so a few words on market development and what we in EQUINOR think could create a fair competition and a level playing field that is optimal for the industry and for the host nations. And first, I'd like to, just remind us that it's always good to learn from the others. And the UK, for instance, and many other countries, but the UK is where we have had most of our experience to date. I would like to take some of the good initiatives from the UK and see that I'm happy to see that some of this is also being now implemented in Poland, for instance. And the goal here is to create sound competition and to bring the cost of energy down. I think that is among the most important things that we are doing. And Poland is on a very good path towards setting up a regulatory framework that enables this. You have a CFD system for 25 years. You have ambitious targets at the national level. I think that is one of the key starting points to let the industry see that there is scalability, that there is line of sight to real volumes, and I think Poland has that. I'm also very happy to see that there is a sector deal in the making, and I think that is also one of the success factors from the UK. It creates alignment across industry and government, and it is always a good thing to jointly set up targets and agree on some base rules when steering towards large-scale deployment of offshore wind. There's also something around local content, which I think is highly important in developing markets. And we always try our best to use local vendors, both in our oil and gas business, as well as in our offshore wind business. And we do really strive to do that. But there's something about these voluntary targets versus required targets. And I think in any case, if we want to abide by European law, and that is what we have to do, then it's a bit difficult to force local content requirements. But it also has a tendency to drive up cost before there is an industrial base ready to take that assignment. So that is something I think it's important when steering towards a low cost of energy. And sometimes you see in countries outside of Europe that there's high ambitions for local content and high ambitions for driving the cost of energy down. And I think there's often some kind of a problem there in meeting both those ambitions. Also, something around level playing field is relating to auction and auction regimes. What kind of auction systems do you have? Is it a price-based auction, or is it a beauty parade type of auction? And my recommendation, at least, and our recommendation would be that, to the extent possible, it is easier to relate to a price-based auction system more than beauty parades. And I think one more thing, and this goes back to learning from other successful nations when coming to deploying offshore wind, is avoid introducing too many cost-driving requirements that haven't been tested out before. So I'm going to try to save some of the time that we have gone over with Marius. I'm going to try and just say a few things about what I'm very happy to see that the EU and the member states around the Baltic Sea and other parts of Europe as well are now engaging in. And I think this, the notion of hybrid projects, I think it is extremely important. Yes, it is difficult from a regulatory point of view. It is difficult in creating the exactly right incentive mechanisms to share the cost and to split the revenues in a fair way. But I think this is something that the EU and the member state really have to, and the industry as well, by the way, really have to make its best effort to make happen. I think it allows for a more efficient use of grid and of acreage. So that is a high priority from EQUINOR. I also would like to applaud the high focus in the strategy on offshore and onshore grid development in general. I think this is a really important measure in order to balance the market better and to avoid the future risk of having price cannibalization as an effect of an inefficient grid and too high congestion of intermittent renewables in small pieces of the European energy market. The grid is highly relevant to that end. I also would like to encourage the good work and all the political focus around the maritime spatial planning. Extremely important in utilizing the acreage as good as possible. And then lastly, my last point here is to continue the work in increased simplification of the permitting procedures. There's something about sense of urgency and making this as quick as possible, of course, without cutting any corners, of course. But there's always room to improving the efficiency rate of permitting procedures. So, Marius, I think I'll just stop here. And I didn't bring any slides because I sometimes prefer just to speak rather than following a script. But I hope this gave some kind of response to your initial question, Marius. Thank you.
I think it gave a great response to what we have been talking about. And I think traditionally I will point out to one issue that you have mentioned as the first speaker, the permit granting procedures, which are extremely complex, especially in Central Europe. And I must say from my own experience that the first 10-year regulation from almost 10 years ago didn't resolve the problem, unfortunately, at all. So I think this is something that the Commission will have to look in together with the Council and the Parliament very in-depthly in the coming months in order to try to streamline the procedures, because it's still something that is not being worked out. So thank you for those insights. And as we're almost finishing our time, so I will quickly pass the floor to Radu Dudau, again from Bucharest, from EPG. Radu, I know that you might have problems with the video, but I'm hoping that the sound will be okay. So you're the last speaker, but absolutely not the least. But this gives you a unique opportunity to wrap up the discussion and also give us your insight on what will happen in Central Europe with respect to offshore wind.
Thank you, Marius, and thanks so much for inviting me. I hope you can at least hear me well. I'm having this pesky issue with the video system just by installing WebEx, but never mind. This at least will compel me to be shorter at the end. Indeed, we at Energy Policy Group finalized and published a study recently on the offshore wind potential of Romania. Mr. Gheorghe Visan, a bit previously, was kind to show a lot of our main data. We did assess a total theoretical capacity of 94 gigawatt by using a turbine model of 9.5 megawatt. It sounds huge, but it's not really huge. It's important. It's an important potential. It is in a way we needed a method of gauging the wind resources, and it's in a way as if you find a gas field or some other resource, and you're trying to assess it, and we basically calculated what if the entire Romanian maritime space would be covered with the exception of about 10% in turbines of this capacity at a capacity density of 5 megawatt per square kilometer, and we came up with this figure. But of course, you have to keep in mind that in the EU, only about 60% about 60% of the maritime space is already taken by other activities, military, fisheries, nature, protecting natural zones and archaeological and so forth. So the bottom line is considering that the shallow water potential, which is about 22 gigawatt as we assessed, would be used at, let's say, no more than 15%. This would still mean about 3.54 gigawatt that could be installed until 2030. Now, to do that, a lot must be made. Bear in mind that until very recently, the Black Sea was not even on the EU map of offshore wind. Indeed, not even in Bucharest did decision maker take it seriously. The entire conversation was about natural gas. But now there is definitely a lot more interest, of course, on the heels of the EU strategy, offshore strategy itself. But also because the government and the important players in the private sector, important energy companies, have shown interest in investing potentially. The thing is, there is very little by means of regulations and planning that really takes into account the offshore wind sector. So we'll have to do a lot from scratch. And in our study, we're also approaching the regulatory aspects, the grid development aspects, including the offshore connectivity. As mentioned before, we think it's paramount that Romania is able to cooperate with Bulgaria, the other member state that is a riparian of the Black Sea. And on a longer term, the involvement in Turkey and the Ukraine non-EU member states will be decisive, especially regarding the cost effectiveness of offshore connectors, hybrid projects, as were described here. So I think it's very encouraging that this field can take off in Romania on the back of this EU impetus. We expect that the authorities will move pretty quickly with a new regulatory framework. In fact, the Romanian Parliament is already considering a draft bill for such a framework, but we at EPG have been a bit critical. It looks a bit over rushed to us. I think for the time being, we think utmost importance should be paid to the maritime special planning that is to be submitted to the European Commission by the end of March anyway. So, and I fully agree that this maritime special plan has to be aligned with the energy strategy and NECP, and that Bucharest really develops the capacity for intergovernmental work, because a lot of consistency, long-term consistency, has to be ensured between various offshore activities. And the last thing you want is to spend unwisely financial resources that are maybe once in a generation, or even rarer than that. So yeah, I'll stop at this brief and general introduction, and if there are more specific questions, I'll be glad to take them.
I will compliment Radu for giving us the perspective on the developments in the Black Sea. I think, as a few speakers have already indicated, Black Sea is a bit behind what is happening in the Baltic Sea. Nevertheless, the potential there is huge, and not only for offshore wind, but also other technologies, other renewable technologies. I'm pretty certain that in the next 10 years, we will see it develop at least as rapidly as the Baltic Sea.